Welcome to the Decentralized Podcast, where we break down the world of Web3, digital assets, and DAOs with me, your host, Pietri Basson. In this episode of the Decentralized Podcast, we have a conversation with Christopher Farmer, Senior Managing Director at Teneo. Chris is really at the cutting edge of digital asset liquidations, having just worked on the 3 Arrows Capital liquidation. In this episode, we cover a lot, from how Chris got set up at Teneo to the process of doing the liquidations, some war stories and lessons learned from the 3 Arrows Capital process. I really hope you enjoy this episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We've done a little intro. People know your background. We start out a little bit more about the person. So I wanted to ask you, how does a guy that started out in Essex, eventually went to Australia and then ended up in the BVI. What's the story and how did you end up in the BVI in the end?
It's been a bit of a global tour. I mean, honestly, the answer to that is I was just chasing the sun. Having grown up born in North London, grew up in Essex, as you say. I pretty much lived my life within about a 60-mile radius of London. Went to university in London, started training with an accountancy firm in London, and I, looked at the big wide world and thought there must be something else out there. Luckily for me, I stumbled across a beautiful Australian who became my wife. She gave me the opportunity to leave, and I love London. I'm a London born and bred, but let's be honest, it's fairly grey and miserable most of the time. Moved to Australia. We spent a couple of years out there, and then having had that experience in London and the exposure to offshore financial services, BVI, where there was an opportunity that opened up, and it was just too good to pass up.
Okay. And how did that BVI opportunity come across your plate? Did you know some folks there? Did they invite you over? Or?
Yeah, so there's actually there's a number of reasons. My wife had worked on a number of engagements between the London office and the BVI office. I had experience through the financial services insolvency I've been working on in London. A couple of my best friends, actually one of my best men, my wedding, worked in the BVI for a number of years. And then a few other people that we worked with in the London market had been to the BVI or had worked there. They all spoke highly of it. So we always had the kind of feelers out there with, if there was an opportunity that came out and it was the right opportunity, then if they could get in contact and let me know, and I could go and join them in the sun, I'd be very happy to do so.
Okay, cool. It sounds like your wife was pretty keen to move as well. Wasn't hard to convince her.
It was. I mean, she'd want to go back to Australia for a while when we were in London, which is fair. Yep. We were in London for a number of years. We had a couple of years back in Oz, but I think she could see the opportunity that was there for both of us, given that she also works in the same profession. Yep. So it's wonderful having a wife who's on island, who's my direct competitor.
Yeah. Direct competitor.
Direct competitor.
Nice.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
fun dinner conversation.
Well, people generally like her more than me. So when we get invites to parties, I'm generally the plus one.
Okay, nice. Were you doing liquidations back in the UK and Australia, or how did you get into the liquidation space?
Yeah, good question. So I originally started off in audit, and it's a great training ground. You learn a lot about how businesses operate. I was looking for another opportunity, and insolvency restructuring came up in the London office. Specifically at that point, kind of core administration type work, which is very common to the UK market, less so on the contentious insolvency side. I actually found myself then working in financial services insolvency, and a lot of the jobs we had were based in Gibraltar, Mauritius, Bilbao, Geneva. So I had to travel around quite a lot, and that really opened my eyes to the opportunities that existed within the sort of wider contentious insolvency market, and that's really when I started to sort of fully hone in on where I could pursue my career in this area.
And then getting to the BVI, I'm guessing initially you started out doing normal insolvencies, funds, those kinds of things. So how did you sort of sharpen your teeth in the BVI before you started with the digital asset side of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the BVI is given the nature of the entities that are incorporated there's a lot of whole companies. Whilst there are also a lot of funds in place, there's a lot of a very disparate array, or very broad array rather, of special purpose asset holding vehicles with underlying assets. Digital assets really weren't on my radar until when I first entered into the BVI. Now, I should backtrack on that slightly, because I first became aware of BTC roughly in around 2012, when the first sort of the major bull run that I heard of had occurred. And I remember friends of mine who were getting investing into this thing called BTC, and I had no idea about blockchain or distributed ledger technology or any of the terminology that I'm now commonly au fait with. And I was trying to find out how to buy some of this stuff, because the market seemed to be going parabolic, and my friends were supposedly making money off of this. But it was almost impossible at that time to find a way into buying Bitcoin. Mt. Gox was the only exchange that I became aware of that you could actively trade and purchase Bitcoin that was SEPA compliant. That then led to an interest in what was going to be, I thought, an asset class that maybe in existence for a number of years or could potentially fall over, but it was something that was a profit-making enterprise at that time. Fast forward to 2024, we've seen the growth of Bitcoin from what it was $200 in 2012 to $44,500 it's trading at today. So that really, when I got to the BVI, my focus was very much on where is there an opportunity for us in a market that is hugely volatile, subject to peaks and troughs, and as an insolvency practitioner, what are the skill sets that I can bring to an industry that is going to be at some point subject to a downturn?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think maybe if we take it back one step, for those folks who aren't familiar with liquidations and insolvencies,
sure.
What is that process? How does it work? And where do you come in? What is your role in that whole process?
Yeah, great question. So liquidation insolvency is it's the final step in a company's life cycle. So they can be entered into a liquidation process for a number of reasons. It can be a voluntary liquidation, which is where you're just seemingly the desire is to wind up the company. That could be because of group rationalization reasons or cost saving, etc. I.e., an entity and a structure is no longer required. Or there is a involuntary liquidation, which is often via an order of the court, and that will occur where petitioners who are owed money and have issued statutory demands or have outstanding debts owing to the company seek to wind up the company for the benefit of the creditors, i.e. to take control away from the current management and to appoint a liquidator such as myself and my colleague Russell, who I work with on 3AC, as a liquidator over the company, and we thereby take control of the management and affairs of the company. Our primary duty at that point is to the creditors of the company. We are there to protect and secure the value of the assets and ultimately to realize assets to make a distribution.
Okay. So you're pretty much coming in, taking the assets, making sure all of the investors and other parties are getting the value that they need to get to go through that.
Giving the creditors an opportunity to realize their investment.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Then you sort of mentioned that you got to the BVI, you were looking at different opportunities. Especially when you started setting up your digital asset practice. I'm sure digital assets weren't popular. There haven't been the 3 Hours Capitals, etc. of the world. So how hard was it to actually convince your company to explore and invest into this? And what sort of legwork did you have to do beforehand to be ready?
Yeah, again, I mean, as we said, the market was only going in one direction.
Yeah.
It's difficult to pitch insolvency when the market is on an upward track. But I mean, ultimately what it was what goes up must come down. These things are, as I said before, subject to cycles, and the volatility of the asset itself therefore lends itself to periods of uncertainty, should we call it. So my pitch really was that, we needed to be in a position whereby, should an insolvency occur, we were already in a position where we could take control of the assets, have options for brokerage in terms of realizing the value of the assets, and have in place solutions to being able to carry out on-chain forensic analysis and investigations to, one, secure the assets of the company, and two, to give us further investigative powers to go and obtain other assets that may have been beyond our reach originally. Teneo, for me, they were very receptive to the idea. We'd had Teneo itself had a lot of exposure to digital assets via its strategic communications team, Stratcom's team in the US. So it wasn't their first kind of dalliance with crypto assets. So they were very open to the idea. I pitched it to our CEO. He gave me 20 minutes of his time. He was a very busy man. And ultimately said, why do we need this? Came off that 20-minute call and gave me the green flag.
Okay, awesome. I mean, it's great to hear that they were supportive in that and they actually invested in it. What kind of infrastructure did you guys have to put in place before you were able to take on any liquidations, actually be ready for one?
Yeah, absolutely great. Again, another great question. The real three key pillars there. You've got custody, because you can't protect and secure an asset unless you have a custodian solution in place. We've discussed this before about different types of custody that can be put in place. So custodial, non-custodial. Non-custodial, where you're effectively holding or self-controlling the assets, is in a position that's very uncomfortable for a liquidator, where there's increased level of risk of loss or hack or whatever it happens to be. So what we needed in place was a custodial solution that provided insurance to us, to mitigate any risk of potential loss. That led us to we actually use Anchorage Digital Bank in North America, who are a federally regulated, qualified custodian. They act as our primary custodian. They also have a linked brokerage solution. So that was the second limb. We needed somewhere that we could take the crypto that we'd taken custody of and access to market liquidity to be able to realize value. So they were really the first two stages, and that is not a cheap process. I mean, that is something that takes time in terms of investment by myself and other members of the team, and obviously the cost of establishing the custodial solution. But we've had a relationship with these guys now for over 2.5 years. We've utilised them heavily on 3AC, and it's been a relationship that continues to blossom.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then you said the other legs were?
The third leg was really the asset, so the on-chain forensic investigation and tracing. So again, we partnered with one of the world's best known providers, Chainalysis, who we've had a relationship again with for a number of years now, who provided access to their Reactor product. So we have 8 people under a user license based across our UK office, US, Cayman, BVI, Bermuda, and Hong Kong, and we have individuals in each office who have qualified to work with Reactor, and we've worked with Chainalysis in-house team as well to build out additional development and training for our staff, and that has really given us a kind of an ability to undertake large-scale forensic, very detailed tracing exercises that otherwise we just simply wouldn't have been able to accomplish.
That side is actually really interesting. I mean, you've now done traditional liquidations, tracing of assets. Now you've dealt with sort of digital asset tracing and liquidation. How does the tracing of assets differ between a traditional liquidation versus on the crypto one?
Do you know what's funny? Where you're dealing with centralized entities, so ultimately whether it ends up in an exchange or some other form of service provider, it's very analogous with that of traditional tracing, because you're dealing with a centralized exchange is again a bank, right? Look at it as a bank. You can go to a bank and get a Norwich Pharmacal application or some other form of disclosure application against the bank for information pertaining to an account. It's the same with an exchange, except it's pertaining to an address. So those are very common, although tracing of transactions via bank statements is somewhat different to tracing hops on chain. And that's really where you need the forensic tools to be able and the expertise to be able to undertake that type of tracing. But ultimately the end goal is the same, and the access to the information is from the service provider. Where it's very different is when you're dealing with decentralized, so when it's DEXs or when you're dealing with DeFi, because that solely doesn't exist. That's a new concept. And the ability to be able to, you can't issue an MPO against a decentralized exchange. You just, it exists on chain. You would issue it to the smart contract. I mean, there's just no way of doing it. So that is where the challenges arise.
Okay. So, I mean, I can think that that's very challenging. And then you're using some of those analytic tools to start identifying specific addresses, flows, potentially identify individuals that you can subpoena to get assets.
So that's right. I mean, what we start with is the pseudo-anonymous alphanumeric string, which is the address. We use wallet profilers, so we use Nansen and DBank and other OSINT and proprietary tools to allow us to analyze the transactions that have gone through those addresses. Its interaction with DeFi protocols, etc. At that point, there are limited options to what you can do. I mean, I think one of the sort of, I guess, most groundbreaking steps that we took was to allow us to give notice to addresses via airdropping of NFTs, because there is nothing to prevent you sending anything to an address. So we mint an NFT, and within that NFT is metadata link, which effectively links to a notice of our appointment with contact details, whatever other information we want to put in the metadata, and we airdrop that into the address in the hope that the controller of the address will, interact with it. We'll get notice of our appointment, and then will contact us directly. There are certain things you can do within the NFT link, for example, setting up trackers for IP addresses, etc. But that kind of giving away the golden goose if I go too much into the detail.
No, I mean, but that's really interesting, because even for someone interacting with that address, if they see that that kind of NFT is there, they can know that this address is linked to a liquidation. And potentially you're dealing with assets that are linked to a liquidation that will be seized.
Ultimately, I mean, if it's company assets that we're seeking to take control of, yes, precisely. So it's giving opportunity for notice in what is otherwise a completely anonymous alphanumeric string.
I mean, but that's actually a great transparency. In traditional world, if I'm buying something off someone, there isn't a little tag on it that says these assets might be part of a bigger liquidation. So I think that's actually a really interesting one. I mean, that sort of sets the scene. We've spoken about it a lot of sort of how it works and what it is. The one thing I really want to start getting into is 3 Arrows Capital. I mean, can you maybe, how were you guys appointed on that? How did that actually start? Because you were ready for it, which is the first step, but then how did the actual appointment happen, and how did you get appointed there?
Yeah, so I mean, we sort of wind back to early 2022 when the crypto market sort of reached its nadir in November, December, and then started to fall off somewhat towards January, February, March, April, and then we get into May with the Terra Luna crash. We were at this time watching, with bated breath and seeing what was happening in the market, because the amount of leverage that was being offered and available, it was crazy, right? And there's always going to be participants that are over leveraged in that position. Now, we don't know that as external parties. We can only sort of guess and have a hazard a guess as to what's going on within the wider market space. Traditionally, our appointments, they come from a creditor seeking to appoint an insolvency practitioner, and they'll do that either via offshore or onshore counsel. So we had, the package set up, the program set up, the custody and brokerage and the forensic solution there ready to go. And we've made, the onshore and offshore lawyers aware of this as a service offering. But as you said, at the time when everything was going up, it's kind of, you might drop it on someone's desk and they go, well, that's really interesting, but crypto, it's now trading at 55,000. Why is this relevant? Luckily for us, that some of those lawyers had also, invested time and had an interest in crypto and digital assets. It could see potential opportunities in the future and have kept us in mind. And ultimately, when the creditors sought to appoint, we were contacted with the opportunity. And the process is effectively an application for the appointment of liquidators. In this case, it was provisional liquidators, but at the hearing, it was turned into a full liquidation appointment. And Russell and myself were appointed on, I think, the 27th of June in 2022.
Okay. And then sort of what's your first critical steps? I mean, you're appointed.
Yep.
And then what do you do the next day? You sort of, I'm sure you're like, okay,
yeah.
here we go. But what do you do?
Quite. I mean, I was actually at dinner in London, having just attended an Insol conference where we found out we were appointed. So the first thing I did was I phoned our custodian and I said, we need to be ready to go on this as soon as possible. Got the brokerage solution lined up. Got the team ready to, get Chainalysis fired up for the first sets of investigations. And the first step was I was on a plane. I got on a plane with a few other members of our team, and we flew out. Specifically, our forensic e-discovery guy, very important in this piece, given the nature of the assets we're dealing with, and also the voluminous books and records and where they're held. So we all got on a plane to Singapore, expecting to turn up and have access to the offices and the books of records of the company. And now, as it transpired, that wasn't actually the case, but that was step one.
Okay. So, I mean, in a normal liquidation, you would go to the offices, seize assets, start working through everything, and then see what you can liquidate. This was a more interesting one because, I mean, the two founders sort of went on the run a little bit, and they were very active on social media during that period. As a liquidator, what were you guys doing while that was all going on?
Yeah, I mean, we were surprised by the lack of cooperation, I think it's fair to say. And it's been well documented that there has been a continued lack of cooperation throughout the period of liquidation. But for us, all we can do is reach out to those providers, such as the fund administrator, other persons who are related to the entity. Counterparties are incredibly important because ultimately they're the issuer of assets to which the company holds. And in the crypto world, you know this very well, with token issuance either by a smart contract or there be some form of distribution. There's always a deposit address, right? And we can trace back the flow of funds, and then so counterparties are incredibly important for us. We were incredibly active in terms of tracing and tracking and making sure that we had identified parties to whom we should be reaching out to or having contact with. It was almost a carpet bombing approach at one point. It's just as many people as we can possibly, that 3AC had ever been rumored to touch. We were contacting and trying to bring into the liquidation to assist us.
Okay, very interesting. And then I think this was a very interesting point is you guys actually served notice to the founders on Twitter. How did you guys come up with that idea? And is it the first notice being served on Twitter that you know of? Because I haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, it is novel. I believe it's the first time it's been done for individuals as opposed to a corporate. I believe it may have been pipped to the post by issuance on a corporate. But ultimately, the reason it happened is because when you get an order in the BVI from the BVI court, you have to serve that order on the defendants, in this case the founders. The founders aren't resident in the BVI, so we can't issue it to the founders in the BVI. So we have to then seek orders for service out of the jurisdiction, and assuming that they will not accept service, we also then need orders for alternative service. And one of those methods of alternative service was via Twitter. And the reason we used Twitter was because we knew they would have been active on Twitter previously. They actually went dark on Twitter for a period of time after our appointment, and it was only because of their activity using Twitter again, which allowed us to effectively convince the court or demonstrate to the court that Twitter was something they were now actively using again and would be an appropriate medium through which to serve them. So we have a 3AC liquidation account handle, and we have, anyone who wants to go and find it on Twitter or on X, you can find it. And within that, there's a list of all of the orders that have been effectively served upon the founders via the use of Twitter.
Okay. I think it's an interesting one, especially dealing in the crypto world. I think traditional liquidators probably haven't ever thought about using Twitter to actually serve notice, and then using block explorers, etc., to build up evidence, identify addresses, start going into that. You've had to use that kind of evidence going to the court, trying to convince them about certain addresses, etc. Have you been able to use Chainalysis, for example, at the court to be able to get certain orders, etc.? Are the courts receptive to that, and do they understand how everything works?
Yeah, we have, and they are becoming more educated in the piece. I think the beauty of a tool like Chainalysis is that it, and this is a real pitch for them as well at this point, is that, that the output from their model, from the reactor model, is something that is very easy to digest. It's in graphical form. It shows hops. It shows a starting point. It shows an end point. You can download all of the data that you need around it, all the underlying analysis, and present it as part of a package. It's not simply a data download of Excel data, which is completely unmanageable. Say, for example, an Etherscan report that just nobody can digest. This is much easier to understand, and that information, whilst certain of those accounts have been doxed or tagged, and it's a lot easier to then show that those addresses are associated with certain individuals or persons. It's following through the funds flow and getting to a point where we can demonstrate to the court that it's more likely than not that the address that we ultimately identify is an address that is either containing assets held by 3AC or an asset or an address that was controlled by 3AC. We have used that information, that tool, and output from Nansen and output from other OSINT tools before in our submissions to court, and they have been very successful to date.
Okay, well, I mean, it's probably one of the unique things here is you can build the whole picture. To say this asset, I mean, you're not going to say at 100% certainty, but 99.9%, it's all coming from linked accounts going to the specific. So it's really good evidence in there.
Exactly, and that plays through to when we're seeking orders against, or Norwich Pharmaceutical orders or other false disclosure orders against centralized exchanges. It's exactly the same process. We're using the tool to be able to build out the flow of funds to then say, okay, this is where the funds ended up. Because as we all know, with an exchange, with a centralized exchange, you transfer your crypto from your address to effectively your user account on the exchange. That then immediately gets swept up into a hot wallet, a commingled omnibus wallet. You can't trace through the exchange. That's where the bar is. Ultimately, they're using it unlikely as an off-ramp or some form of conversion. Maybe it's a token swap, etc. But we need that information. So we need to be able to see what's happened inside the centralized exchange from the centralized exchange. We can only get that information by proving the funds flow into the exchange. At that point, obviously, depending on the information we get from the exchange, we can then onward trace. So that allows us to bridge what would otherwise be an information gap in our piece, i.e. what happens when it's within the exchange.
Okay, interesting. And how has your I'm assuming you've dealt with a large number of exchanges, different counterparties. I mean, the 3 Hours guys were very active. How's the cooperation been? Have you been able to sort of gather a lot of that information to be able to trace the asset to where it finally was sitting?
Yeah, so we've, to answer that, I think we've got recognition in 7 jurisdictions now for that very reason. For that very reason, simply because of the need to obtain information from these exchanges that are based in different parts of the world, rather. And yeah, it's a requirement really because, and I understand the position, an exchange has a relationship, a contractual relationship with via its terms of business with an account user. And, it is required therefore to protect the data that has been provided to it, subject to, say, for example, a US subpoena or whatever it happens to be, but I'm just a mere liquidator from the BPI. So it's unlikely that we're going to get cooperation by just giving notice. So we require the recognition in the jurisdiction to allow us to then access the local bankruptcy laws to get disclosure from these exchanges.
Okay, so you can't just pitch up and say, I'm Chris, I'd like to get this information.
I mean, that would be wonderful. That would certainly save a lot of time and effort and cost. But yeah, ultimately,
have a look on Twitter.
I can give, to the extent that any exchanges would provide that information to me without an order, I probably suggest you don't use this.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'll get the list of anyone who shared afterwards. You completely understand the position.
Yeah, completely.
There.
Yeah,
and it's actually good to hear. but they're taking it seriously.
Precisely. And ultimately they're relying upon an order that's been produced by the court, and the court has sanctioned an action that we have put before it, and it all goes back to the evidence that we put before the court.
Okay, interesting. I mean, if we're sort of running through the life cycle, then you're actually getting to the final assets, wherever those might be, at specific custodians, where like cold wallets, whatever. I'm assuming that over here you had a very wide range of assets. You didn't just have ETH and BTC.
Correct.
I mean, Anchorage custodies a lot of different assets, but I'm sure there were assets that they didn't support. What do you guys do in those kinds of situations then for those kinds of assets? And I know, Three Arrows were doing very early VC stage and SAF stage investments where the token wasn't even issued yet.
Right.
So what do you do with all those wide range of assets?
There's a certain number of esoteric tokens that you just, if the honest answer is, it's very difficult to know what to do with them.
Yeah.
We have, obviously the layer one, majority of the layer ones and the ERC20 compliant tokens we can hold with Anchorage, fine, that's where they go. We have solutions set up with token issuers who hold tokens for us, effectively in proxy accounts as trustee or custodian for 3AC. A lot of those tokens are subject to lockup or vesting periods. They can be staked, which is, often can be staked, which is fantastic because that's passive income being earned for the estate. And some of that staking, some of these tokens have significant yields that are being generated by, no bonding, no slashing staking. So that, it's really almost a no-brainer that you would put them into these pools to generate additional income. Beyond that, you then have the tokens where they have to be issued to 3AC. We can't custody with a custodian, so self-custody becomes the only option, but there has to be a kind of material level of value at which point you're comfortable in holding self-custody of a token via a ledger, for example, as an option. Our job is to effectively realize value of the assets. It's not our job to speculate. Now, whilst we work with very, very closely and hand in hand with the creditors committee of 3AC, we do have to take decisions as to when we bring assets out of self-custody into liquidation in a very timely manner.
Okay. You segued perfectly into the next thing. The next step for you guys is to liquidate assets. And some of these assets are very illiquid, small markets potentially. How do you guys do the liquidation process? Are you using OTC desks, selling in the open market? And how do you make that decision in terms of when you're liquidating?
Yeah, really, there's a huge range. There's a huge range of options that we have. We have access to OTC. We have principal and agency desks that we use, which is primarily where we put the liquid tokens through. We've had our first sales round, which related to a number of SAF, SAFE, and other equity investments, where they were subject to restrictions on consent of transfer, but the consent was issued by the counterparty, which allowed us to market those assets. So that's effectively an auction process whereby we put out the asset to any potentially interested parties. We have gone through a process alongside our US broker-dealer of whitelisting X number of potential purchasers, and those purchasers are then given an IM, effectively, which is sets out the assets that are available for sale within that round. There is a bidding process, there's a closing date, and ultimately we decide whether to make a sale or not based upon the asset, based upon the bids that we get. It's more difficult for the illiquid, or where we have a SAF, for example, the token that's not gone through a TGE yet or a token genesis event. How do you price something like that? And that's a little bit more difficult to deal with. And if there's relatively low demand in the market, or there may be relatively low demand in the market because of the fact that it's not yet trading and it's an unknown. For those types of assets, there really is almost a wait and see type attitude to it, because ultimately it hasn't been issued. So we carry the value at the investment cost, and the investment cost is invariably, can be considerably lower than the value of the token once it actually is issued on mainnet and then distributed to us. But there's this huge range of options for us that we can access. But really, this has grown organically as we've gone through the process of the liquidation. Persons and organizations have reached out to us and they've presented us with the solutions they have in terms of sales options, right? And we can talk about having Sotheby selling all of our NFTs. That's a great example of a prime provider who's generated increased revenues for realizations for the estate simply because of it's Sotheby's. Through to very small or other almost decentralized protocols that have been contacted by the founders who say, look, we have this and it runs via smart contract and this is what it does and this is the opportunity it gives you to get out of certain assets or to liquidate assets. And if it's an option that will realize value and maximize that realization, then it's something that we've we've either taken into consideration and parked for maybe in the future, or we've actually engaged with.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, especially Sotheby's other parties starting to step up.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been a fun experience for you guys, or interesting experience at least, seeing your assets go up on Sotheby's. Going up for auction.
It was incredible.
How did that conversation go? How did that actually come to be?
Yeah, so Sotheby's reached out to us because they were aware of what was referred to as the Starry Night portfolio, which was 3 AC assets that were held under the Starry Night portfolio name, which included the sort of famous goose ringer that I think everyone in the crypto world is relatively au fait with. Sotheby's reached out to us and offered us the opportunity to partner, and we had a number of other providers who we were considering. We went to New York, we met with the Sotheby's guys. They actually gave us a tour of the auction rooms. On that day, they had the NBA, they had an NBA auction going on, but they had a private room at the back with all of Michael Jordan's memorabilia, and that was there. They gave us a sort of showing and a tour. They gave us the feel for how they go through the process of running an auction for what are effectively material goods as opposed to non-fungible tokens. They have the metaverse, which has been running for a number of years, for which they run their NFT sales. So we spoke more about that. We went through the process. We looked at their history. We looked at the prices they'd achieved against, for example, OpenSea, and what you can see in terms of offers listed, etc. And ultimately, it came down to the access that they have to the market and to the buyers of what are ultimately very niche products, who have the wealth and the ability to engage in high-level auction value, gave us the best opportunity to realize the assets for the most value.
I mean, that's a very clever solution. How was it on the day? Were you guys present for the auction, sitting there, or could you not make it?
So there's actually been a number. We've had there's two parts to the sales. We had the original NFTs that we took control of right at the very beginning of the process, and we've had some other NFTs that have come on. So we hold ETH, so we've got ER721s and ER1155 NFTs, and we've also got XCP counterparty NFTs like Rare Pepes, etc. So we've been running through the process of liquidating the ETH NFTs mainly. We've had a number of auctions. There have been live auctions in New York, in Paris, in Hong Kong, in London. There's been online auctions. There was actually an auction that closed yesterday. And we keep sort of drip feeding is probably the wrong word, but putting out piece by piece, by collection. We've had artist engagement. Coming to Sotheby's and talking to prospective buyers about the NFTs that they may be buying. I think the Goose Ringer auction in New York was the most well-attended auction that Sotheby's had for some time, and certainly was the youngest demographic in terms of those looking to buy, buy pieces of art from Sotheby's. So it's an ongoing process. It continues to this day. And if anybody is interested in purchasing any of the remaining NFTs held by 3AC, then please get in contact with Michael at Sotheby's.
Okay, yeah, reach out to the Sotheby's guys.
Reach out.
You might be able to pick up some interesting NFTs.
Yeah, there's still a lot there that it's just some of them are slightly more, should we say, niche.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, NFT markets are down, so you can probably get some good deals at the moment.
We'll be haggling on that. But
I mean, I think that gets us into the next part. Is you guys realize that value, and it sounds like most of the time you're realizing that value into fiat. Is that normally the case in any liquidation? Or I know with FTX, for example, there are some people putting in a claim at the moment to say we want to actually receive the tokens. Because there's been a big move in the value. So as a liquidator, is that an option for you guys, or do you have to actually pay everything out in fiat?
Realization itself, we've realized into USDC, another stable coin, not just into fiat. We've then taken that and converted it into fiat ultimately, because there's no point in us holding stable coin if we can then transfer into fiat. The fiat is going to be the method of distribution. So to your point, like FTX, we monetize claims as at the date of liquidation. And then creditor adjudication is based upon the value of the claim as at that date. And we pay in US dollar as opposed to paying in rem or in specie via distribution of crypto. It's very difficult to distribute crypto. I mean, you think about the volatility of it one for one, but also the different types of token that we're holding. I mean, the simple range of tokens that we're holding would make it almost impossible to be able to give a fair distribution. And that's really the key, right? So each creditor gets what's referred to as a pari passu distribution, which is an equal distribution. Each creditor of each class is treated equally. To do that with a token, for example, where you may have a token that is, and let's just call it a Class A token, right? And you may have a Class D token. I mean, you can't split the Class A token can't really split the class. So what do you do with it? You can't package them
multiple
together.
blockchains.
Precisely. It's very across multiple blockchains, different layer ones, different blockchains. So it's very difficult to actually make a distribution in specie. And also, not everybody wants to be paid in crypto. Not everybody wants to engage in the payment of the receipt of crypto into an address. Some people just simply want the fiat. And it does simplify the process. And we are walking in the shoes of, following in the shoes of the likes of FTX.
I mean, you mentioned an interesting point is you realize, and it's recognized at the liquidation value. So at the date of that liquidation. So in an instance where, for example, like at the moment, the market has started moving and the liquidation value is likely less than what the selling value is today. Would you then realize all the assets and everyone gets their share of those assets, pari passu, sort of equally?
Yep.
Or would you ever end up in a situation where there is a pool of assets that haven't been allocated because of that difference in value?
Well, I think we use Mt. Gox as an example. Yep. I mean that the trustee, whoever is running that at the moment, they are sitting on a effectively what is a solvent fund, and they are going to have to deal with how they distribute BTC in a solvent situation, i.e., it's a surplus. If the value if BTC goes through another super cycle or goes through a super cycle, and we end up with, I don't know, just to stick out, $200,000 per BTC, and each of the assets that which we currently hold in token form and which we can liquidate, increase in value by 300%, 400%, 500%. At that point, we may end up with a surplus. Surpluses are ultimately returned to shareholders. Now, there are certain other claims that can sit in preference of shareholders, and we can go into too much detail about that, but it's really hypothetical because ultimately the value of crypto would have to go up. It would have to be a parabolic rise, and we would have to time the market almost perfectly, which, again, we're not here to speculate, so it's not our job to do, to get to a position where that would be the likely outcome. I mean, ultimately, that would be a great result because what you're doing at that point is you're paying out the creditors 100%. So we hope for that, but it's unlikely to be the outcome.
And crypto is probably one of the only markets where that might happen.
Yes.
I can't think that in any other market you'll have the possibility of the assets actually exceeding what you had in it.
And with something like Mt. Gox, which went down in 2012, so we're talking about 12 years ago, and the value of Bitcoin was what, $250, $1,000 maybe at its nadir in 2012-13. 44,500 now. I mean, I can't do the math. I can't do the immediate math.
But that's a multiple.
That's a multiple. Yes. That's a significant multiple. And that's unfortunately that's probably not going to be the position we find ourselves in. But for for the Mt. Gox trustees and creditors, that's a great result. Even taking into consideration the time value of money.
Time value of Bitcoin in this instance, which is quite a bit more.
Quite.
Yes. Quite. I think that's one of the fun things of this industry is you end up asking questions no one's ever asked before.
Yeah.
Because the liquidation industry has existed for ages, but I don't think anyone's been in a situation to say we've gone from 250 to 44,000. Yeah. What do we do now?
Quite. And the number of different types of tokens out there, and understanding the tokenomics and understanding where the value is derived from. A lot of that, a lot of our time has been invested into working with the protocols and with the issuers to understand exactly where the value is derived from the token, and to see, not just sitting on an asset that unlocks in 6 or 12 months' time to say, well, okay, we'll take whatever the market value is at that given point in time. It's building out a case. It's understanding where the value drive is for these different types of tokens. And we have an intimate knowledge of different layer ones, right? We know what it looks like. We have layer twos all over the place. We have ZK rollups, we have scalable solutions. If you have these, we have layer 3 DeFi tokens. You have to understand what each of these do and what their role in the ecosystem is, and that allows us to then market the assets of one, the right party, and two, to get the right price on sale.
Well, I'm guessing, you must have had a bit of a crash course in a wide variety of chains, products, etc. Yeah. How did you guys sort of read up, understand how the protocol works, etc., and then speak with the team to be able to make those decisions, or what's the approach there?
That's exactly the approach. I mean, when I first started looking at AVAX, I had to get my head around the X chain, the P chain, and the C chain. So, it's those sorts of things where we end up with an input-output. We're using a UTXO basis on the X chain, and then all of a sudden we're transferring, we're flicking across to ERC20 or EVM compatible C chain. So, I didn't know. I wasn't born knowing that. It wasn't something that in my industry a lot of people probably
I'm sure not a lot of
ever
people
have to come across. Right? But it's something that we've had to educate ourselves on. And again, a lot of that goes to talking to the issuers, talking to our team, using the creditors committee, who are highly experienced. We're talking about the Digital Coin Group, blockchain, Voyager, what was Matrix 4. and Coinlist. These are some of the biggest players in the industry, and their input has been invaluable in terms of allowing us to talk to these guys about what they're seeing in the market, how they understand the product, and then us working together. It's an incredibly collaborative process, this liquidation via the creditors committee, which is often not the case. And it's a good example of how we work together to maximize realizations, hopefully to make distributions shortly.
Okay. I mean, it's encouraging to hear that you know the difference between the C chain, etc. on AVAX.
Yeah, I'd be very. We hold across chains, and my issue would be if we went from one to the other, and it's like, well, where's it gone?
Yes, no, and I mean, it's good to see people from traditional industries really starting to understand the crypto industry, really embracing it, really seeing the value and getting into it. You've mentioned the creditors committee a few times now. For anyone who doesn't understand how that works, sort of who are the creditor committee, how does that work, and what's your interaction with them?
So the creditors committee are a representation of the creditors as a whole. So they act as effectively a sounding board for the liquidators. They have a number of statutory duties that sit out with the Insolvency Act. They're voted in at the first meeting of creditors. So each creditor has the ability to nominate themselves for the creditors committee. And then ultimately there's a voting mechanism that's put in place to determine who sits on the committee. And though, that committee, as I said, given its makeup, has been integral in the process of the liquidation. Really, there's been a lot of back and forth that we've had that otherwise information rather has been sent or given to us. Valuations analysis, getting access to these guys' personal relationships that they have, utilizing OTC desk options, so there's agency in principle, and showing other options out there. Just talking to them about the difference between the AVAX C chain, X chain, and P chain, and why this is important to us, and what we need to be careful of. I mean, that really has added extra value in terms of the liquidation process itself.
Oh, it's great to hear that you've got people with that knowledge and you're working with them, and everyone can sort of make the decision together. If we're stepping back then, looking at the Three Arrows Capital, where are you guys in that process at the moment? I mean, you've done a lot of work. Where are you in the bigger picture with that process?
So we're at the point where we're looking to make a distribution shortly. I mean, so a lot of the information that relates to the liquidation of the company that was produced in the creditors report was confidential, was only produced to creditors because it's only information for the creditors. That report was linked on Twitter or X about, 4 minutes after we sent it. So
okay.
But it goes back to the first creditors committee meeting that we had, where regardless of NDAs having been signed, the presentation by Russell and myself was being live streamed on what was then Twitter. We had to actually stop the creditors committee and ask whoever the person was or persons were to politely stop live streaming the first meeting of creditors.
Did you sort of get a message on the side saying,
you're live? You're live. You might want to just stop this for a moment. So that's been an interesting. We've lived in the sort of glare of social media with this, and you know what the crypto world is like. Right? There's a lot of people. There's a lot of ritual there with the actions of the founders and how 3AC ultimately ended up going into a liquidation process. And there's been a lot of attention to it simply because it was the first big crash after the Terra Luna, or the first big liquidation after the Terra Luna crash. Coming back to your question, so we've been through the process, and we continue to go through the process of taking control of assets and liquidating of assets to build up a pool of funds. And ultimately, when we get to a point where that pool is sufficient, are subject to reserves, and we make distributions, and that's where we're moving to now. So our hope is that we will make a distribution in the very near future, and that will be an interim distribution, not a final, meaning that that's a distribution made, as round one of distributions. And we hope that there'll be future distributions based upon additional assets that are realised into the estate, because the estate value as a whole encompasses not just cash in liquid form or crypto in liquid form. So the only liquid crypto we really hold is ETH for gas fees and USDC for paying certain costs, because I would actually quite like to be paid in USDC because it's almost instantaneous transaction. But a lot of the counterparties that we operate with and a lot of the service providers in the crypto world prefer being paid in USDC. So we have to adopt that payment system as well.
I mean, that's good to hear that you can at least adopt that.
Well, I mean, we adopt it, we've embraced it, we understand it's part of the process. We go through the same KYC AML process checks with the service providers. It's simply that we make a transaction via USDC as opposed to via fiat transfer via a bank. That's the only difference.
Well, it doesn't take 3 days and cost you.
It doesn't take 3 days.
$100 per wire.
It depends what E1's doing at that time in terms of the gas fees. But that's why I'm a big fan of the layer 2 scaling solutions. At least they can sort of speed up the process slightly. But look, that's really where we currently find ourselves.
Awesome. Then maybe taking a bigger picture look, I mean, you're probably one of the first liquidators to deal with something of this scale in the crypto industry. What would you say are some key learnings that you've taken away from this?
Yeah, I think this isn't something you can kind of wake up on a Friday and pick up a job on the afternoon and then start running with it on a Friday afternoon. With all due respect to my fellow IPs and everybody else out there in the industry, you do have to have the solutions in place to be able to provide custody, brokerage, forensic analysis and tracing, etc. You do have to have teams that have a background knowledge or at least interest in crypto. It's to your point earlier about the investment that we had to put in at the beginning. That does take time. It's time cost and money cost to get yourself to a position where you're capable of actually servicing this type of engagement. I would certainly suggest that the relationships with counterparties is key. You have to be open to having conversations with persons who are not traditional finance people. They work in a decentralized world. It's different, and you have to be open to that. You can't shove a square peg into a round hole by saying, well, this is how we operate, and expect everyone else just to dance to your tune. Collaborative partnerships and being open to ideas, not just shutting off the idea that somebody could provide, for example, a raffle system for NFTs, because there are NFTs that may have relatively limited value, but that could be an opportunity to maximize realizations on that specific part of the portfolio. And ultimately, I just think time, really investing time into educating yourself about the blockchain, the process, talking to your peers, talking to other people within your teams, the wider market. Cayman and BVI are great for this because they're just packed full of people who are involved in funds. Persons like yourself at Hash, etc. The guys you can get in to give you experience and first-hand recollection of, or first-hand education, as it were. That's really the key to it, I think. Yeah. And it's very nascent. It's very new. We are, as you say, almost the first people to do this, and certainly in a hedge fund sense, because a hedge fund is so different from an exchange. Exchange is an exchange. Exchange is just, you've got tokens, you take control of them, you deal with creditor claims, you liquidate tokens, you distribute tokens. A lot of other types of equity agreements, right? But subject to there having been a massive fraud, like FTX. There's a lot of investigative work going on the outside of it. Just a straightforward liquidation of an exchange should be that. It should be straightforward. Hedge funds and frauds just bring a whole different perspective to it. And you do need excellent legal representation, and you need legal representation that has access to resources that are global and have knowledge in digital assets. So we, to the extent I can pitch this, we have Ogier in the BVI who are prime counsel. We use Latham & Watkins and Holland & Knight in the US, who are at the very forefront of the digital asset space. We've been using other law firms around the world, so Wong Partnership in Singapore, and Appleby in the Seychelles, and these guys are giving us what we need, giving us the toolkit and the experience to be able to go and recover assets for the creditors of the company.
I think that's where I'm seeing a lot of value is people with traditional skill sets applying themselves to the digital asset industry, because there's a maturity and experience that comes with that. But if you don't actually go and learn about the different chains, how everything works, etc., the two don't really meet each other. And I think that's where, some of the law firms you've made, a lot of the firms on the island, you've got people who've really applied themselves, they really understand it.
Absolutely.
And they can actually advise you. They're not saying, oh, well, this is like a security, so it must be. They can actually say, well, the chain works this way, etc. So the professional providers are really important, and getting the right people in the room.
And I think you're right. The education piece, people are within each of these firms. These are all global great firms, right? All the offshore firms, the onshore firms, they all have their specialists who are upskilling massively in crypto, because it's going to be required in the future. And whilst we are seeing an uptick in the value of crypto again, and I hope it continues on its perpetuity because it's good for the estate, what goes up must come down. So at some point we're going to go through this again. And I think we've discussed this before previously, that the value of the next fraud is probably going to make FTX and all the others that happen in 2022 look like tiny events.
I think that's in the bigger picture. If you look at the crypto industry, we're still a drop in the bucket. We're in it, so it feels like you're almost late to the party. It's been going on for ages. But I think there's a lot of potential, and the values are definitely going to get bigger. So
I agree with that.
I mean, interesting to watch. But I mean, now you at least have service providers who can deal with these things.
Yeah, quite.
It isn't. I mean, whoever is the next liquidator can give you a call.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Yeah, quite.
I don't know what your hourly rate is.
Well, I'm more than happy to charge 5 times my hourly rate for any other IP who'd like to be educated on the piece.
Awesome. I mean, that's a good getting into it. If people want to contact you guys, they want to learn more about Teneo, what's the best way to learn more about you guys, get in contact?
Quite just simply Google us. I mean, Christopher Farmer I Teneo. Teneo has a dedicated digital asset and blockchain team with which I sort of globally coordinate. You can find our details on the Teneo website. There's the cryptocurrency capabilities. Reach out if you have any questions. I always love to talk about everything crypto, especially love to talk about the engagement of 3AC and the other engagements that we've been involved in. And look, just, thank you for this opportunity to come and chat. I know we sort of spoke back in 2017 about this as a sort of very nascent idea, and it's just amazing that it's actually come to fruition.
Yeah, no, it's funny to see those very early conversations, and then now today we're sitting here in the Cayman Islands, and having a conversation about probably one of the biggest liquidations yet. So it's awesome to see. Chris, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Decentralized Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and would really appreciate if you could like and share this episode if you got any value from it. If you also can follow us on YouTube as well as wherever you're getting your podcasts to make sure you don't miss the next episode. If you want to connect with me, please follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can find the links down in the description. And I'd also like to thank our partner for this episode, Provenance Compliance. Provenance takes care of all your compliance, KYC, and AML requirements, and they can also perform cryptocurrency security audits. I use Provenance on a lot of my clients. They do a really good job. We've had really good feedback from people going through KYC and AML, which is usually a painful experience, but Provenance helps to make it really smooth, and they make sure that they comply with Cayman, BVI, and any other regulatory requirements. If you want to learn more about Provenance, you can find a link to their site in the description. I'll see you on the next episode.